I know from watching the first 10 seconds of Hakim's video in Ukraine, we're going to have to do a whole thing of just explaining why the Soviet Union actually fell. Okay, Hakim video on how the West destroyed Ukraine. Can't think of anyone else who has got anything to do with destroying Ukraine right now, but okay, let's see.
Hello.
Hello.
Ukraine has been in the news plenty these last 2 years, but what exactly was Ukraine like before all of this? Let's take a look. In 1991, Ukraine supposedly gained independence following the illegal and undemocratic dissolution of the USSR against the will of the overwhelming majority of the nation's population.
Ooh, that's a lot of things. He said a lot of things. Okay. Gained independence after the dissolution of the USSR against the will of the majority of its population. Like, every sentence there's, like, every section of that sentence is false. It's like, all right, let's do a breakdown. First of all, when anyone says illegal, unconstitutional, and this is why we don't like it, especially if they are a revolutionary, they don't care. No one cares about law, okay, and constitutionality if you're a revolutionary. I'm sorry, like, you only appeal to that when you're maybe not too sure about what the moral argument is. That's it. Sorry. Liberals like laws, you know? Center-right people like laws. They like law quite a lot, actually. Law and order. Not these guys, okay? Was the Russian Revolution legal or constitutional? Like, come on. Does that make it bad that it was illegal? Not really, no. So, what's he referring to when he says the majority will of the population? He'll be talking about this. He will be talking about the referendum in 1991, because this is how the narrative goes, okay? If you're an apologist for the Soviet Union, you refer to this. You refer to a referendum in 1991 where the peoples of the Soviet Union, 15 republics, were asked, do you consider it necessary to preserve the union of Soviet socialist republics as a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics, in which the rights and freedoms of a person of any nationality will be fully guaranteed? To which 77.85% say yes. So 77% plus say yes, 22% no. And not long after this, by the end of the year actually, December, the Soviet Union is dissolved. Damn, how'd that happen? So everyone votes to stay in the Soviet Union, but then they dissolve it. That's crazy, chat. That's insane. There's a few gaps though, okay? First of all, this referendum, he doesn't mention, the people don't mention that this referendum was boycotted by 6 different republics, okay? And also, there's a very important caveat here. A renewed federation of equal sovereign republics. What does that mean? It's referring to reforming the system, democratizing, etc. That's what it's referring to. And the problem is that this part here, that staying in the Soviet Union and preserving it was contingent on, didn't happen. These reforms failed. And in part of these reforms failing was that in August of this year, March, so August is later, there was a coup. There was an attempted coup by communist hardliners who wanted to get rid of Gorbachev and Yeltsin. They arrested Gorbachev. They tried to arrest Yeltsin, but failed. And in those 3 days of them attempting to coup the government, they tried to institute a state of emergency and they paused political activity and they started trying to ban like newspapers and outlets. In those 3 days, that was what it was going to look like if they were actually successful. Now, the coup failed, and obviously, these people, after seeing these reforms fail and seeing almost a communist hardline coup on the government, that was when the republics of the Soviet Union were like, whoa, fuck this. Like, we are never taking a chance with these guys again. And something that Hakim doesn't mention is very shortly after this coup, actually the same month, one country in particular, followed by a number of other ones, declared independence. The first one was Ukraine, August 24th. They declared independence. Other countries had been rebelling before that. The Baltics were very, very rebellious before this, all the way from like the late 80s, because I guess the point is that the 15 republics of the Soviet Union, which are, can I remember them? Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Moldova, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. Did I miss any? Yeah. There's a lot of instability, okay? Because the Soviet Union was not necessarily formed due to the consensus of all the people living in it. Believe it or not. Turkmenistan, did I forget Turkmenistan? Imagine forgetting Turkmenistan. Like, a lot of these countries were not just brought into the Soviet Union of their own free will, okay? The Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, were annexed in the 1940s by the Soviet Union as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That's why, and as a result of this pact between Stalin and Hitler, in 1941. No, wait, 39. Fuck me. As a result of this pact, 41 was obviously when it broke. Yeah. So as a result of this pact, these countries stayed in the Soviet Union all the way up until the 90s, right? So there's a lot of unrest. It takes a lot of suppression and a bit of an iron boot to sustain that kind of system, which is why you have a lot of unrest, you have protests, you have riots, you have already like Warsaw Pact states like Poland, Germany, all that like falling to bits under Soviet rule. You've got fall of the Berlin Wall. You've got situations, say, like in the 50s, where you've got Khrushchev having to send tanks to quell unrest in Hungary. And that's why the communists in the UK who supported it became called the Tankies, because there was a split in the British Communist Party where some of them supported Khrushchev rolling tanks to suppress unrest in Hungary. Others opposed it. And the ones who opposed it called the ones who supported it Tankies because of tanks. The first people to ever use that word were other communists against communists, yeah, which is very typical. So anyway, you've got the August coup after this in March. You have a failed coup by communist hardliners. Everyone at this point in the Soviet Union is like, whoa, fuck this. We have no interest in trying to carry on this project at the risk of that happening again. So they start having referendums. Most of them have their referendums in 1991, after August. Not all of them, some before, some after. You got Lithuania. And you look at the results here, talking about the will of the majority of the population. These are pretty resounding results. And there were already signs of this beforehand. When Gorbachev finally allowed people to have elections in the Baltics in the 90s, in 1990, people voted for nationalists. They voted out the Communist Party Soviet Union. They voted them out. So there were already signs of this way beforehand. Ukraine, look at that result, 92.26% before the fall of the Soviet Union, before the dissolution. So before the illegal dissolution, Ukraine's already declared independence, and they've already voted for it, 92%. If you want to look at the exact numbers by region, you've got that as well. Crimea voted in favor of independence from the Soviet Union, 54%. To summarize the fall of the Soviet Union in the way that Hakim just did, is to make it sound as if someone, I guess, probably Gorbachev and the Russians and the Soviet Supreme Court, all that these people just randomly decided to dissolve the Soviet Union just because for the lols, and no one actually wanted it to happen. Nah, at that point, the Soviet Union was done. The dissolution of the Soviet Union happened after all these countries declared independence and voted for it. And after a bunch of them had seceded as well. Like, there was no Soviet Union left to dissolve when it was formally dissolved. The dissolution at the end was just a formality, really. Just like, well, on the 25th of December, we just lower the flag and then put up a Russian one, and that's it. And then just get rid of all these bodies that no longer have any power over the countries that they used to. That's it. You ever notice the thing that happens on Twitter where Marxist-Leninists have a particular level of disdain for people from the Baltic states? Well, that's because a lot of this opposition to the Soviet Union from the republics was spearheaded by the Baltic states. They were arguably the most unruly lot near the end of the Soviet Union. They were the ones who voted for nationalist parties over the Soviet Union Communist Party. They were the ones who did the famous Baltic Way, where across the borders of all three countries, something like, I don't even remember how many people this was, but it was like a lot of people, like I think millions now, basically holding hands across the borders of all three countries in a human chain in support of their national independence and their opposition to being part of the Soviet Union. And this is why people from the Baltics in particular, but also even just like Ukraine and other parts, are often so disliked by Marxist-Leninists. It's not because any majority of these populations are Nazis, okay? Minorities of them are. In the Baltic states in particular, there is still a kind of a problem where Nazis who fought against the Soviet Union have a little bit too much leeway given to them. The official narrative of these countries is still that the Nazis were bad. The problem there, though, is that they tend to treat Nazis and Soviets as if they're like equally bad, which is problematic, but it doesn't mean that they like them en masse. It just means that they're given a little bit too much leeway. That's a problem, but that's not why Marxist-Leninists hate people from Eastern Europe. That's not why they don't like them. Ukraine didn't really have this problem. More people in Ukraine, despite the Bandera statue in Lviv, more people in Ukraine fought against the Nazis than with them. The number of Ukrainians who fought alongside the Nazis in World War II was like less than 1% of them, whereas you literally had millions of Ukrainians like fighting alongside the Red Army. So the reason Marxist-Leninists don't like people from Eastern Europe and don't like to talk about the fact that these countries voted en masse overwhelmingly in favor of independence before the Soviet Union was dissolved is because this is the part of the world where you had 75 years of indoctrination, of control over the education systems, of suppression of nationalist movements, where you had every opportunity to spread the word of Marxist-Leninism to these people. As soon as the Iron Curtain fell, and as soon as people had the choice, everyone lost interest. No one in any of these countries has any fucking interest in Marxist-Leninism anymore. No one cares. No one thinks it's a good theory. No one thinks it speaks to them as workers of the world. No one thinks that this is the best way of analyzing what's happening to them on the world stage. No one thinks that this is the solution to their problems in the working class. No one believes that over here, even though they had all the opportunities in the world to get educated and pushed into that direction. They wanted the fuck out. They wanted the fuck out even under the Soviet Union. All the way throughout, they were unruly, they were suppressed, they were kept under authoritarian rule, to the point where even like poets were thrown into fucking prison for speaking out against the government. And yet, after all that, the Iron Curtain falls, they've got a choice now, and they're like, nah, don't like it. Don't like communism, don't like Marxist-Leninism, none of it. And that's just really humiliating for communists. It's really humiliating to think that they had 75 years to try and, fix these people or whatever, to try and educate them and push them in the right direction and to control what they were getting exposed to in terms of information and media and everything. And it was all for nothing. It was all for absolutely nothing. The Baltics, when you think about it, the Baltics were rescued from the Nazis by the Soviet Union. Like, that's a way that they could spin it very easily, because had the Soviets not taken back the Baltics, had the Soviets not taken back the Baltics, you would have had the hunger plan in those states. You would have had the Nazis imposing fucking expected percentages of those populations of Slavs to either starve to death or get deported. You would have had like 85% of, was it Lithuanians, just like killed as a government policy. It's hard to spin it that way since we were deported to Siberia en masse. But that's the problem. But even with access to that level of education and access to people's media and everything, they weren't able to do it. They weren't able to win over that population. They just called Baltic Slavs. Sorry. The hunger plan was driven by like anti-Slav rationale, but yeah, whatever. I don't think the Nazis distinguished all that hard. Yeah, that's probably why. Anyway, sorry, that's the first. God, that's so much disinformation in one sentence. Oh, God.
Afterwards, Ukraine was forced to experience a tough transition from a centrally planned economy to a so-called free market economy via shock therapy and rapid bargain price sale of state assets, similar to what Russia experienced, which I've made a video on here. Unsurprisingly, severe economic instability, inflation, and widespread corruption were the result. These early years were also politically unstable as different blocs fought.
Also, the idea that widespread corruption was the result. Is he suggesting that they didn't have corruption in the Soviet Union? You know that these people who became oligarchs and the people who became, Putin himself, right? A lot of these people who led the kind of like corruption in the Soviet Union, people always say blame it on the IMF, right? Blame it on shock therapy. Well, shock therapy was obviously a failure, okay? It was a horrible fucking project. It resulted in massive levels of human suffering that didn't even really need to happen, right? Like, because other countries that came out of communism, particularly not Soviet Union, but Slovenia in particular, they were given a very different treatment to shock therapy that actually cared about preserving social services and like a level of social democratic institutions. And they actually did all right. And the same with even the Baltic states and Poland is like when they eventually were taken away from the shock therapy doctrine towards an approach that actually emphasized social spending a little bit more closely, then they started to improve as well. Like it was a massive failure. Now, whether they did it because they were malicious or because they wanted to make money, it was partly economists who led this. So they weren't really making that much. They weren't necessarily the ones making all the money out of it. Some of them were ideologues. They just thought that this was the best way to do things. Other ones, probably did pick up a penny on the way as well. Yeah. When it comes to Russia, though, I don't know why people assume that Russia didn't have any agency in this. You know that you need two sides to agree to these reforms, right? The Russian leadership and the Russian people who had money at the time, they were all for these ideas because they got loaded off of it and they consolidated a ton of power out of it. And, not coincidentally, quite a lot of them had also been corrupt during the Soviet Union as well. These people had made money under Soviet rule. Because of, I think the way that they made money a lot in the Soviet Union was like, depending on where you were, if you were in charge of like allocation of housing, people got really rich by taking bribes because it was really, really hard. It was really, really hard to move house over like back then because queues for state allocated housing were so long. So people who were in charge of allocating housing took bribes to let people bump the queue. Because before then, a lot of people were just stuck living in like these kind of dormitory style things or like shared accommodation with like 20 people living in a little flat. I still have that one Soviet housing document burned into my mind. Don't know which one you're talking about. Well, the one that we read on stream. Oh, that one. Yeah, yeah. So like corruption was rife in the Soviet Union. And the same people who made money off of the loopholes and the exploiting their quotas and things like that in the Soviet Union also made a massive penny during shock therapy as well. So I just wish there was a bit more agency ascribed to both ends when people made that argument.
For power within the new capitalist state. At the same time, Ukraine's geopolitical location keeps it very attractive for Western interests. As the second largest European country, bordered by NATO members and Russia, and a transit country for 2/3 of Europe's natural gas from Russia, it of course plays a pretty big role in the region's stability and energy security. Couple this with access to the Black Sea, where Russia has a major fleet, and you have the reasons the West convinced Ukraine to give its nuclear arsenal in exchange for so-called security assurances, under an agreement called the Budapest Memorandum in 1994.
Why are they called so-called security assurances because what? Because Russia violated them? Why is it always so called? Why is everything? Why is he? I can't even tell half the time why he's delivering everything in such a sarcastic way. Like, does he think the free markets were not? They were more free than they were in the Soviet Union. Of course, they just call them free markets. You don't like free markets. Just call them that. They don't like them. It doesn't have to be. Why does it have to be so called? What? Why is it a so-called security assurance? Which countries are currently the ones supporting Ukraine against their big security threat right now? It's the United Kingdom. They're helping Ukraine. United States of America, they're giving a lot of arms to Ukraine right now. The ones who violated this in exchange for Ukraine giving up their nukes was Russia.
Throughout the 1990s, Ukraine tried balancing a cautious relationship with Russia with pursuing closer ties with Western institutions, most of which were and still are hostile towards Russia. All the while, the country...
Hostile in what way exactly? Militarily? Well, obviously not. In what way were they hostile to Russia? People forget this, but like in around 2010, 11, 12, like under Obama, and when Medvedev was in power in Russia, America and Russia were not massively antagonistic to each other compared to what they are now. They were sharing access routes in Uzbekistan during the Afghan war. Russia was very sympathetic to America during 9/11 because obviously Russians don't like Muslims very much because of Chechnya and shit. I think it was America that got Russia into the WTO. Their relations were not... There was visa deals that were made between America and Russia at the time. Bush and Blair had good relations, but yeah, it's like, I don't know why you're saying like hostile to Russia. The timeline's just like a little bit off there. If anything, you could argue that the hostilities in terms of media and rhetoric started to amp up on the other end, first of all, because when Putin was caught engaging in electoral fraud in 2011, 2012, that was when he started realizing that in order to keep his local population at bay, he massively accelerated his rhetoric against the United States, because if you have a foreign enemy and a foreign threat, that's when you get to distract your local population from issues at home, from your domestic issues. It's a very common tactic. And that's when you start to see like the spread of like RT in the Western world. That's how I generally understood it. I don't think there's much evidence that it was the West that made the first move in the 2010s-ish when it came to hostility towards Russia. Yeah, why was Obama so milquetoast when Russia invaded Georgia, or when the annexation of Crimea? Why was he so tepid on that? Well, if you look at it now, it's actually kind of crazy that he was so tepid on that. But that's because like their approach to Russia was not actually that aggressive. I don't know why people decide to push that idea. I know what they mean. They mean NATO expansion, because apparently countries in Eastern Europe voting for governments that join NATO is apparently like aggressive towards Russia. Well, okay.
Faced soaring inflation, killing living standards, and eroding public trust in the new government, unsurprisingly. This caused frequent power changes in Ukraine, but it's not enough of a reason to explain two defining events in Ukraine's modern history. Let's take a deeper look.
Initial engagement. Okay,
Since independence, NATO has pursued Ukraine aggressively, hoping to bring it into the Western sphere of influence, which basically means becoming a vassal state. First...
No, it doesn't. A vassal state. You know that these countries, when they join NATO, these countries elect their governments. Maybe difficult for a Soviet person to understand. They elect their governments, and those governments appeal to join NATO. If you want a government that doesn't want to join NATO, you vote for a party that says they're against joining NATO, or even one that wants to pull out of NATO. These countries do their bits for NATO of their own free will. That's why if you look at a country that's in NATO and poll them on NATO, pretty much always, the majority of them will say that they like NATO. That's it. Imagine calling Turkey and Hungary American vassals. It's again, details don't matter to these people. It's all just, this is why people talk about when they say read theory. Again, the problem with doing theory and pursuing it in like a dogmatic sense like this is that you don't actually need any empirical data at all. You just need, Western capitalism, imperialism, every economic trade deal, any defense alliance, everything just becomes vassal states. It becomes comparable to the Soviets annexing the Baltic and then holding on to them for 50 years under an iron boot. This is exactly the same thing to him. Actually, it's better because the Soviets, did it in the name of working class politics, whatever the fuck. Yeah, it's just so called, eh? Why is he talking about the West aggressively pursuing Ukraine for NATO? What does that mean? In what way? When Ukraine tried to join NATO, when they asked for an accession plan to NATO in 2008, NATO said no. They didn't give it to them. They just gave them a conciliatory message at the end of the summit in Bucharest and said, one day, Ukraine and Georgia can join NATO. And that's why Putin got mad and went for Georgia. Actually, the reason that NATO did not put Ukraine on a path to NATO membership was because they wanted to appease Putin. They didn't want to anger Putin. Bush pushed for it. Yeah, Bush might have wanted it, but again, is that aggressive pursuit? NATO members have to agree unanimously on a new country joining. What's the NATO countries? Because NATO requires their countries to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, right? But for most of that time, most countries didn't actually do that. Only like 3 or 4 of them actually did that for back in 2014, only a handful of countries were doing that. But now, again, they do it willingly. It's not a requirement. Okay, it's like an expectation, a guideline, yeah. But that's what I mean, yeah, like vassal state, where they actually just say, we'd like it if you did this, even though most of them, for most of the time, didn't. Why do you, but now a lot of countries are spending more than 2% of their GDP on defense, especially the largest proportions are incidentally places like Estonia, Latvia, Poland. What do you think happened in the last 4 years that made these countries start matching and even exceeding the NATO guidelines? Why do you think they started doing that? Is it because NATO forced them to? No, it's because Russia invaded Ukraine.
It made Ukraine the first nation to join the hilariously titled Partnership for Peace, a NATO program in 1994, followed by 2 other NATO-Ukraine structures in 1997 and the 2000s. These partnerships were aimed at forging closer security ties and enhancing Ukraine's defense capabilities, which is of course just code for total reliance on NATO and its productive centers, mostly the US. Despite these mostly backroom deals, public support in Ukraine for NATO
I don't even know total reliance when they talk about what? For defense or for economics? Because I'm pretty sure when it came to reliance or even just like economic desires, Ukrainians wanted to be aligned with the European Union. That was where their split came with Russia, not the United States. I don't even, how is he able to do this? How is he able to get away with he's not even making an argument. He's just saying everything's so-called and saying everything sarcastically, without going into any detail about what it actually means. I wonder would he even be able to tell you just tell you a paragraph about how the Partnership for Peace works? Would he know? Mearsheimer agrees with Hakim. I know, and that in a nutshell is the entire fucking problem. Yeah.
Membership has, historically speaking, been pretty low. For example, a 2008 poll showed that 55% of Ukrainians opposed joining NATO, while only 22% were in favor. Of course, the desires of the Ukrainian population have always been a headache for Ukrainian politicians who sought closer ties with NATO. Moving on though, politically, Ukraine swung wildly.
I wonder if we're going to look at Ukrainian opinions in 2014 on joining the European Customs Agreement versus the Eurasian one. The European Economic Association. How are those numbers now? Yeah, Ukraine polling NATO. It's pretty high now. You should debate him. This guy will never do a debate. Sorry. You think this guy's going to have any interest in going into detail on any of these questions? He would die.
Between Western and Russian aspirations, hence its slightly confusing foreign policy over the years. In 2010, President Viktor Yanukovych adopted a non-bloc status, meant at improving relations with Russia, which was later abandoned for a renewed push for NATO support. In addition to the Budapest Memorandum, a trilateral agreement between the US, Russia, and Ukraine signed in January 1994 committed the US to providing Ukraine with millions in financial assistance for dismantling its nuclear forces and storing fissile material. On the other side, Ukraine got low-enriched uranium fuel rods from Russia as compensation.
Yeah.
This agreement made Ukraine one of the largest recipients of American assistance at the time. While this aid was crucial during Ukraine's early post-Soviet years, with Ukraine still doing horribly despite it, it came with strings attached, unsurprisingly. The US has claimed as a matter of foreign policy that a stable and secure Ukraine is essential for a stable and secure Europe. In 2016, though, the establishment of the, and excuse me for the mouthful, Vice Presidency of the Government for European...
Well, here's an example, of why Ukraine was particularly interested in moving away from Russia economically towards the EU. It's because if you look at countries that are aligned with the EU economically, at their GDP per capita, Estonia, Latvia, Hungary, Poland, Lithuania, it's all quite high, right? Belarus, a bit less. Armenia, Ukraine. This is from 2014, right? This is when they were, when they still had Yanukovych in there, when Yanukovych was equivocating very, very blatantly on whether or not he would actually honor the Ukrainian people's wishes of joining the EU association or the Eurasian. Why would they want to? Who knows, eh? A country with this much wealth and natural resources and this much of a strategic positioning would be suffering this much economically compared to countries that were more EU aligned. Why is it always the idea that it's so ironic that he's using, because he's talking about two things at once and conflating them so badly. He's talking about Ukrainian desire for joining NATO, whilst also using that as a proxy to talk about Ukrainian desire for their economic alignments. Because in 2014, is he going to talk about how Ukraine was polling in terms of joining the customs agreement with Eurasia or with the EU? Because this was where the big split happened. He doesn't talk about Ukrainians wanting to align with the EU. I know, because it's inconvenient, right? Because I guess it's the only country that matters here from the West is America, even though Ukraine was not at odds with Russia because of their positions in America in 2008. That's not why they were at odds with Russia. They were at odds with Russia over the European Union. That's what the entire 2014 Maidan Revolution was all about. I wonder if we can get the polls from that. Even Mearsheimer has that. He had that in his polls. He just didn't really mention it. He didn't really draw that much attention to it. Where is it? Mearsheimer. Why Ukraine was the West's fault. Mearsheimer does this as well. I wonder if this is where Hakim got the technique from. If you look in this video somewhere, he shows you his polls, his polling data on where exactly Ukraine was sitting. This is their polling on joining NATO, okay? So here there's a split. Western Ukrainians want to join NATO. Eastern Ukrainians don't want to join NATO, okay? So most Ukrainians on whole, even 2015, are not that interested in joining NATO. That's not the reason that they were fighting with Russia. The reason is this one here. If Ukraine could only enter one international economic union, and again, the way that the Eurasian customs deal works is you have to choose one. You couldn't choose both. What would the following be? It would be the European Union. Obviously, everyone in the West is saying European Union. When you go to the East, though, Kherson, well, even Zaporizhia is in the East, and that is large majority wanted to join the EU over the Eurasian Union. Even at the bottom, though, even at the bottom where they're a bit more ambivalent, even then, it's even in the far east of Ukraine, Odessa, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, even then, more of them want to join the EU than want to join Putin's customs union. This is why Ukraine's ended up splitting with Russia. This is why the fighting happened. This is why the protests happened. This is why Yanukovych eventually had to flee. Was because Yanukovych initially promised that he would sign up to the European customs agreement.
And Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine, dogshit name, let's just be honest, this made Ukraine's pro-Western stance very clear. This policy was reinforced by constitutional amendments in 2019, which would embed NATO and EU membership as strategic goals to actively pursue, and of course this was pushed through by EU and NATO-backed groups within Ukraine. Back to the video in just a minute.
And also the Ukrainian people. We're not going to say that because they pulled in favor of the European agreement rather than the Russian one. Okay.
The Orange Revolution, marked by widespread protest and demands for reform, occurred in November of 2004. As reports of election fraud emerged, sounds familiar, the opposition leader Viktor Yushchenko called for supporters to protest in Kyiv's...
Wait, are they comparing it to, are they comparing this to January 6th with election fraud? You understand that election fraud actually happens in countries like Russia and countries that Russia has under their thumb. He's saying that the fraud allegations here were false? I don't think I've ever heard anyone make that argument outside of Russia. What the fuck? Oh well, no details, it's sure, it's fine.
Independence Square the next day.
Apparently every time someone ever says electoral fraud, it's all false because it was false when the Republicans said it. Okay.
The movement was mostly fueled by the usual economic frustrations and grievances against the Russia-friendly Kuchma government, not just election fraud. The demonstrations, filled with orange banners and balloons and scarves hence the name, disrupted government operations and forced a new election. This is the official story, at least. The truth is more complicated.
Oh.
There was genuine, non-astroturfed discontent in Ukraine at the time, but the high levels of organization from the very beginning points to an external source of, well, let's call it help. In the years leading up to this moment, the US government spent $65 million supposedly promoting democracy in Ukraine, mainly through organizations like Freedom House and the National Endowment for Democracy. Over $18 million was for election-related assistance in the 2 years before the 2004 election.
If you're going to suggest that this is rigging, you need to go a bit further than that, because almost every former Soviet state at this time, as they were transitioning to holding parliamentary elections, were getting money from the United States and from the EU to help them set up their electoral processes, because they hadn't done it that much before. It's quite normal. Yeah. Is he suggesting that every country in Europe, in Eastern Europe after the Soviet Union, had like fucking fraudulent elections, and otherwise they'd all be going, what, pro-Russia? Again, the thing about the National Endowment for Democracy and all this funding that came from the United States to Ukraine, first of all, it's not even that much given the size of Ukraine, 18 million. What the fuck you talk? You can look at, like, this funding sources are all public. You can see where they go. They have it, like, yeah, it's insanely low amounts of money. To do what, though? If it's, okay, if you're going to sarcastically, to so-called promotion of democracy, if you're going to say that, okay, what did it actually go to then? Where are the receipts? I wonder if I can get some of the examples here. Laserpig and Sarcasmatron did a fantastic historian skewering of this kind of conspiracism. Well, the problem is these guys just all live in the exact same world as when the Americans helped a fucking coup happen in Iran in 1952. That's the world that they still live in. They still live in the Cold War because it's the only time when they were ever fucking relevant, right? Now it's just, we just have to paint everything with the same brush, even though, again, things have changed. It didn't used to be the case that when the Americans were helping like an anti-communist nation, that all the funding and where they were going and which organizations they went to was all public, and you can actually see just notably just how small a lot of these results, these sums were for each different institution. Didn't used to be the case. It used to be all be very secretive, and it had to come out in like the Contra affair and shit like that. Kissinger was open about Chile. I don't think it's quite the same as how open these guys are about what they do in Ukraine, because what they do in Ukraine is not that controversial. You can look at their list of grants here, like from the NED. This is around, I think this is 2018. But at the end of the day, in order for any of these funding projects to work, it's not just American funding. You need people on the ground who are willing to actually contribute to these institutions and actually utilize these grants. And these grants most of them are really small, 36,000, 55,000. Radio organization. But again, for example, even this one, a radio organization, the funding comes from the NED. This $36,000 and the actual radio shows and the talk shows and broadcasting, this is done by Ukrainians. The Ukrainians appeal for the funding, and then they go and do the thing. That's what happens. But like all these funds are so small. Fostering youth activism, basically Hitler Youth. Whoops. So I feel like even if Hakim wanted to further this conspiracy theory, you could at least just show some of the funding and where it went, especially for a country that was struggling with things like corruption for quite a while, and obviously that started going down since a lot of these projects came in. But yeah, this happened like everywhere in Eastern Europe. I don't know why he's singling out Ukraine for it.
Western ambassadors actively engaged with Ukraine's opposition forces, providing all sorts of support, which some keen Ukrainian officials called meddlesome. It's also very convenient that election observers trained by these NGOs were responsible for the reports of electoral fraud, which lent credibility to the opposition's claim. Diverse methods were used to engage the public, like public transport posters and internet-organized rock concerts to attract younger voters. It sounds cringe to me, but whatever.
Again, like, it's just... Would it have been cringe if it was like... if it was communist rock concerts? Like, what? Why? Again, this is the thing. It's any attempt to avoid the fact that most Ukrainians supported this, that most Ukrainians preferred to lean towards the EU and towards democracy and towards free markets and towards parliamentary elections and away from Russia. That's it. Also, it's not as if they weren't showing signs of this before 2004 even, because even Ukraine, even back when Ukraine was a lot more torn on their opinions on Russian relations before, way before 2014, even then they had conflicts. Even then, Ukrainians showed that they had red lines. They had the Tuzla dispute. This was when Russia tried to construct a causeway on a sandbar island near the Kerch Bridge. And Ukrainians were up in arms about it. Like the Russians actually had to pull back from doing this because basically the Russians did it on Ukrainian territory without support from the Ukrainian government. They did it unilaterally. And even that like little sandbar island right on the edge of Crimea under a bridge that no one should give a fuck about, you'd expect. But yeah, they cared. They cared about that because even they had their red lines when it came to Russia overextending their influence in Ukraine. This is before the Orange Revolution. Or did they actually only get mad about this because Americans paid them to? I don't know. One question for Hakim. If it's all American money and American meddling, why were Ukrainians so much quicker to support EU integration than they were to support NATO? Like you said, most Ukrainians didn't give a fuck about NATO until just recently. But they leaned towards the EU for like at least the last 10 years, probably longer. Why would that be? If all the money is coming from America? If it's all about NATO and America, why did Ukrainians take so much longer to warm up to NATO than they did to warm up to the EU?
The leaders of the Orange Revolution would go on to squander their political capital by squabbling over power and property, paving the way for the next so-called revolution. This next upheaval was called Euromaidan.
You can look at the polling as well. There's an entire collection of polls here. I am actually using Wikipedia on purpose because I know it's a tanky response video. So-called. Hey, look at this. All the way from 2014. Even, I think if you go earlier, even here, we start from 2011 where they're compared. And this gap only gets wider as time goes on. And this is around the same time. 2014, I think still a majority of Ukrainians didn't care that much about NATO. They did care a lot about the EU over the European customs, the Eurasian customs. So we'll see. We're going to get to Maidan. Here we go.
The official story goes like this.
Okay.
These protests began in late 2013, triggered by President Viktor Yanukovych's decision to reject an association agreement with the EU in favor for closer ties with Russia.
Wait. Is he going to mention that Yanukovych initially agreed to it, that he promised the people that he would fulfill it, and that the majority of the Ukrainian parliament supported it by like 300-something votes, and that the majority of Ukrainians supported it? You're going to mention any of that? Anything?
Demonstrators saw this move as a betrayal. The decision sparked widespread outrage among Ukrainians who were already frustrated with corruption and nepotism. As the protests grew, violence became more and more prevalent. Yanukovych's regime responded with brutality, deploying riot police and other security forces to disperse the demonstrators. The escalation of violence, particularly during mid-February of 2014, which saw snipers killing dozens of protesters, broadened and strengthened the movement's base. Eyewitness accounts and investigations suggested that some sniper fire may have come from protester-controlled buildings, but that only adds to the chaos. The government's violent response.
If you're going to mention that some witnesses might have suggested that because there's this one report that's not even peer-reviewed from some Canadian-Russian dude, are you probably not going to mention the much less controversial and contested theory that the fact that Yanukovych had the Berkut firing at people? When people started, the first people who died were protesters who were shot by the Berkut. So I feel like if you're going to mention the incredibly niche theory that basically no one signs off on versus the much less controversial theory that it was actually the Berkut who were shooting at people because the first people who died were protesters who were literally seen shot by the cops. Okay.
Only fueled further anger and defiance, leading to Yanukovych fleeing Ukraine for Russia in February of 2014. That's the official story, at the very least. Something not frequently mentioned is the role of far-right groups such as the Svoboda Party.
Yeah, no one talks about the far-right presence. No one talks about those EU-loving far-right people. No one talks about them. I think Svoboda had one good election where they got like 8 or 9% of the vote. And then after that, they just plummeted. This so-called Svoboda Party. Bleh. This is them in 2014. I don't even... 2014 presidential election. 1.18% of the vote. Right sector, 0.72. It's less than the UK Reform Party. It's far less. Which election is this one? 1.46. That's in 2010. 2019? 1.65. Really? Again, he can't do it. He can't embrace the fact that the majority of the Ukrainians who were not far-right Svoboda or right sector people supported this. He can't do it. He's incapable. It's so... The paternalistic fucking bullshit of these Marxist-Leninist fucks who simultaneously hate Baltic people and hate Eastern Europeans for the decisions they made coming out of the Soviet Union, but also still have to convince themselves that actually the Ukrainian people will identify with their cause. They have to have both those opinions at once. They can't do it. It's the cope is absolutely insane that these people who spent 70 plus years getting educated by Marxist-Leninists and learning about historical materialism and being put in jail if they disagreed with it vocally enough in the public. The fact that they had so much of this opportunity to ram their bullshit down people's throats and then they come out of it, and within one generation, the majority of them want to support the EU and they're willing to fight the police for it. Like, there were millions of people at these protests. Millions.
Although these groups were a minority, they were highly organized and played a pivotal role in the escalation and maintenance of the protests,
which is completely unsourced, by the way. A pivotal role in escalating the violence. Source? Huh?
Considerable resources, including thousands of activists and substantial financial backing. They were instrumental in occupying key government buildings, specifically in western Ukraine. But their contribution, important though it may have been, is eclipsed by the involvement of the US and the EU. As in 2004, the US and EU actively supported the protests through diplomatic channels and financial aid. US Senator John McCain and Chris Murphy publicly supported the protests, with McCain even staging photo ops alongside the leaders of the Svoboda Party. Later, a leaked phone call revealed US efforts to influence the formation of a post-Yanukovych government.
Hey! It's the phone call that no one who cites has ever read. Another question. If these Americans and Nuland and the people in this phone call and the American politicians had such an important role in shaping the outcome of this Maidan revolution, why was the proposals of Victoria Nuland not followed up by the Ukrainians? Do you know what that phone call talks about, right? Like what the solution proposed by Nuland was? The solution proposed by Nuland was an interim government that still had Yanukovych at the helm before elections. That's it. The Ukrainians said no to this. This offer was rejected. This is why the people occupied those government buildings, because they rejected this proposition. They wanted Yanukovych gone immediately. The Americans didn't want that, though. That wasn't that wasn't what they were talking about. And as far as influencing the future Ukrainian government, again, let's just see what he says. See if he talks about Yatsenuk, the guy.
Poland likewise played an active role, with Polish politicians and civic activists highly visible during the protests, providing material support, direct aid, and diplomatic pressure within the EU to support Ukraine's integration within so-called European norms.
So-called.
Interestingly,
Why is everything so
though an
called?
attempt at steering Ukraine towards an EU future and away from Russian influence, the meddling of the West was still in part seen as a manipulation of Ukraine's political sovereignty. Imagine the inverse for a second, though. Russia providing diplomatic and organizational aid with vocal political support for this or that group within, for example, Mexico. Russian leaked calls showing them basically picking who will be in the post-coup government. Maybe one or two of them.
Is he not going to talk about the levels of coercion that Russia went through to try and convince people in Ukraine to stay with Russia? Is he not going to mention that when the Ukrainians, before 2014, when the Ukrainians signaled that they wanted to move towards the EU with that parliamentary vote and the support from Yanukovych, remember what the Russians did? They put sanctions on Ukraine. They started blocking goods at the border en masse and subjecting them to massive, arbitrary inspections and slowing down the Ukrainian economy. They literally said they were doing it. They put sanctions on Ukrainian businesses. They used economic coercion, even though they literally said in the Budapest Memorandum that they wouldn't do that. And this was over the Ukrainians leaning towards a EU deal because the majority of them supported it. You're not going to mention that? You're not going to mention what Russia did after their president, Yanukovych, was ousted with Crimea? What did the West do to Ukraine that was comparable to that? Well, they gave funding to some groups that wanted funding and that wanted to push messages that the Ukrainians supported.
Even being Russian citizens themselves. Wouldn't you doubt the authenticity of such a movement? Just food for thought. Before we move on, though, I should mention that Russia wasn't just sitting idly by during this time. Russia conducted covert and overt operations during Yanukovych's presidency, and later on in Crimea and Donbass.
Hey.
The scale of Russia's intervention in Ukraine around this time dwarfed previous attempts to influence Ukraine's politics in their favor. Following Euromaidan, this by many accounts illegal overthrow of Yanukovych was seen as the final straw for Russia.
Why the fuck do you care about illegal again? I'm sorry, the Russian Revolution was illegal, you fucking idiot. Do you think Yanukovych shouldn't have gone? The guy who was literally having the cops firing his own protesters? By the way, that's not just witness statements. That's not just some conjecture. That's a fact. That's a fact that Yanukovych and his police force, the Berkut, were firing on protesters. What does it mean illegal? Oh, because there's some legal theory that because Yanukovych was impeached with he was impeached by the overwhelming majority of people in the Ukrainian parliament, but apparently there's a threshold in Ukrainian law that they were a few votes short of. But again, this is after he fled the country.
Russia responded by taking Crimea, which they feared could host a NATO naval base in the future, and worked to further destabilize Ukraine until it abandoned its efforts to join the West. Since the mid-1990s, Russian leaders have strongly opposed NATO enlargement, viewing it as a
It's also ironic that it's always, even when it's so clearly the will of the Ukrainian people, it has to be American involvement. So it's not just a coincidence, for example, that Nuland favored that guy, Yatsenuk, the guy she said was the guy, the guy. Is it just a coincidence that Nuland said this about the guy who was the leader of the opposition before Yanukovych fled? Like, why wouldn't he mention that? Is it just because to make it sound like he was this random dude that came out of nowhere? Look, he's not like a nobody. Look at him polling here. He's the opposition. This is 2012 in the parliamentary election. He's got 31% of the vote, 3 points short of Yanukovych's party. He was the opposition leader. So when they have an election after Yanukovych has fled, yeah, maybe you'd expect him to be the guy who gets the most votes. It's not that surprising.
Direct threat to them and their interests. The West's insistence on expanding NATO and the gradual integration of Ukraine into various Western institutions was seen as provocative by Russia. It's hard to disagree with this analysis given how the US makes it clear that they'll cross all these red lines Russia feels the right to hold, and how what Russia feels its right to hold. Does Russia have a right to hold red lines? Does Russia have a right to say to independent sovereign states that they can't join military alliances when they want to? Hakim? Sorry, I meant to say so-called democracies and so-called sovereign states and so-called military alliances that the so-called populations wish to join en masse. The US has surrounded China and all other quote-unquote regional enemies with military bases.
So-called.
Regardless, the conflict worsened the economic recession in Ukraine, with GDP falling by 23% over 2 years. The IMF's involvement further worsened the situation when it approved a $17 billion loan to Ukraine in 2014. As usual, the IMF required Ukraine to implement neoliberal reforms and restructure the national budget around repayment of debt. In other words, economic exploitation of Ukraine for the profits of Western creditors. In some more detail, confusing...
I just, please once, just acknowledge the fucking fact that, first of all, let's say that's all true. Let's say the IMF and the EU support for Ukraine was exploitative because Ukraine's not exactly in the best bargaining position. That's true. Ukraine is a country that doesn't really have that much privilege to choose. Their choice was either economic associations with the IMF and the EU or with Russia. And how did being with Russia from 1991 all the way up until 2014, how did that go for them? Were they doing better or worse than countries that were aligned with the IMF and the EU? They were doing worse. What was Russia's deal, Russia's loan to the Ukrainians? It was a lot of money, but it was also not even written down. No one knew the fucking terms of it. To the point where they said that we'll give you like a 1/3 discount on gas. But then we're also going to have a review process, and we're not going to tell you anything about whether or not we can just rescind that discount on the first review within a few months. And we're not going to tell you any of the strings that are attached to any of this loan money. That was Russia's plan. Russia's plan was to offer Ukraine a big fucking loan with some discounts from gas, and just not tell anyone, or maybe not even write down at all what the conditions were. At least if the IMF gives a country a loan, you can go up and read it and look at what the terms are. Even the EU one. The EU deal that the Ukrainians wanted to be part of in 2014. That you can read the whole thing online. It's like hundreds of pages long of all the terms of the deal. Again, he can't handle it. It just makes him so fucking cataclysmically angry that the majority of a population can support such things. It just makes him so mad.
Fiscal legislation, high tax rates, and preferential treatment for oligarchs severely harmed Ukraine. For instance, the 2011 tax code reduced corporate income tax from 25% to 16% and VAT from 20% to 17%, yet payroll tax remained very high at 50%, placing even more of the tax.
VAT from 20 to 17, does he know what VAT is? VAT going down is not necessarily bad for consumers, like people buy things. Also, this is 2011. Why are we talking about an IMF loan in 2014 to talk about the tax code in 2011?
Tax burden on the working class. Laws passed in favor of the new ruling class in Ukraine originate as far back as 1991. Privatization benefited big businesses and was dominated by oligarchs to the detriment of the Ukrainian economy as a whole, as inequality continued to skyrocket. This exploitation is most evident in the agricultural sector from the very beginning of the so-called independence period, where thanks to these new freedom laws, oligarchs acquired large-scale agricultural holdings with little or no compensation for dispossessed rural dwellers. Rich landowners easily escaped the implementation of new laws that attempted
Do you know
to
what's
gain...
ironic as well is the most corrupt part of Ukraine in this period? It's hard to tell which period he's talking about because he spoke about IMF loans, then he talked about 2011, which is to do with the EU, which happened under fucking Yanukovych. But okay, the timeline's all over the shop, but I guess it doesn't matter because it's, Marxist-Leninism. Empirical data is fucking useless to these people. If we're going to talk about corruption, the most corrupt part, first of all, Yanukovych had a presidential palace. It wasn't a mansion, it was a palace, okay? If we're going to talk about the so-called corruption, I can't even. If we're going to talk about the corruption, the worst place for corruption, which Ukraine does have a lot of, they're obviously, since they've had support from the United States, their scores on the corruption index have been going down. But when it comes to corruption, the most corrupt place in Ukraine before 2014 was Crimea. Crimea, which enjoyed all kinds of land ownership benefits and tourism benefits and loopholes that was exploited to the absolute hilt by Russian oligarchs. It was a holiday destination for Russian oligarchs where the land registry was basically non-existent, and it basically meant that trade deals and land purchases and exchanges could happen under the counter and just be subject to all kinds of scams and corruption and dodging taxes and things like that. It was like a haven. It was a haven for wealthy Russians. That's also why the Crimean Tatars were so... And this was under a relatively autonomous part of Ukraine. This was a part of Ukraine that actually Russia had the most control over. And this is also why the Crimean Tatars, many of whom returned after the ethnic cleansing that was done by Stalin in the 40s, they came back after the fall of the Soviet Union and they were living in Crimea. But as far as getting any kind of restitution or reparations or getting access to housing, it was really, really difficult for them. They struggled intensely to try and get housing. And the problem was that under those Russian conditions, it was basically impossible for them to get back on their feet. So a lot of them actually just resorted to squatting because the property and land situation was so notoriously corrupt in the favor of Russian oligarchs. And getting out from under Russia's thumb would have been beneficial to them for that. That would have helped them escape that. But alas,
in control of underutilized land while they made good use of legal evictions of those lived on the land. Legal is doing very heavy lifting there. Another great idea from American economists came within the same decade in November of 1997. The National Bank of Ukraine allowed Ukrainian banks to include funds invested in the treasury bills market into their mandatory reserves, resulting in a decrease in reserve requirements and quality, essentially making short-term loans to the government from private actors a part of the national cash reserve. By the middle of 1998, treasury bills accounted for 12% of total banking assets and about 30 to 40% of liquid assets.
Why are we at 98 now? What the fuck? We're absolutely scattering all over the shop now. This is when levels of Western influence in Ukraine they're all over the place.
Basically meaning the Ukrainian government heavily relied on short-term debt as cash flow, which is unsurprisingly highly unsustainable and unstable. The banking sector suffered as there wasn't much that wasn't debt that could be used to invest or provide loans with, either to state-owned industry or to private Ukrainian business hoping to grow through loaning extra cash. Under capitalism, limited availability of credit for productive investment means there's no real growth that can occur economically, rendering Ukraine even more economically unstable.
You realize this is the situation that Ukraine was trying to get away from, though. This is why Ukraine wanted to lean towards the EU. This is that one simple fact that countries in the EU from Eastern Europe that were former Soviet states did much better aligned with the EU than they did aligned with Russia. The ones aligned with Russia were what? Ukraine, Belarus, and to a lesser extent, Moldova. Moldova were kind of like coerced into Russian integration to some degree. Those were the three countries that in Eastern Europe that aligned more with Russia at this time. And they were the ones that suffered the most. And this is actually where Ukraine was in 1998 as well. He seems to forget that although Ukraine was going to free markets and capitalism around this time and taking loans from the United States, from the IMF, they were also economically still massively under Russia's thumb. They were still tied economically to Russia.
Weak wages and pension policies that have plagued Ukraine for decades and poor revenue administration didn't make things better. While all of this is bad, it pales in comparison to the biggest economic exploiter of them all, the debt trap. Ukraine is a very rich country, but to access that wealth, you need investment. If the nation is run by and for its people, the wealth can be utilized for its people, as it was prior to independence. When Western capital and their political representation lands in a newly shock doctrine...
Is that why why over 90% of those people voted out of the Soviet Union? Okay. Must have been fucking banging before their independence. Was it really? By the people, for the people. What, before they had free elections? Yeah, the famously not Russia-centric USSR. What was that thing again? What was that little event that happened when requisition of Ukrainian grain resulted in a famine that got like millions of people killed? What was that event where Stalin issued a decree to stop starving farmers, starving rural people from leaving their villages to look for food, and where they were killed if they did? The secret directive that was called Preventing the Mass Exodus of Peasants Who Are Starving, that Stalin signed himself. What was that called? They even named it. They gave it a fucking, they gave it the funniest fucking Preventing the Mass Exodus of Peasants Who Are Starving. What was it called? It's called the Holodomor. Anyway.
They're coming to make a profit, not to help. The debt trap I'm referring to is one imposed on Ukraine by Western institutions before the 2022 Russian invasion, beginning as...
Yeah, how many, which ethnic group did the Westerners deport en masse in the hundreds of thousands from Ukraine? God.
As far as 1993. Already, Ukraine was the second largest debtor to the IMF after Romania and the 10th largest debtor to the World Bank. This has gotten much worse recently. Ukraine's foreign debt stood at about $8.8 billion in late 1997 and $10.7 billion in the middle of 1998. In September of 98, the IMF approved the
From Ukraine, good save. Man, these people don't give a fuck about Germans getting deported from from the Sudan. They don't give a fuck about that.
extended fund facility loan for Ukraine of $2.2 billion. Very quickly, the government started to have problems not only with the new deficit financing, but also with rolling over the existing stock of debt they already had. The IMF's stringent conditions included the usual sell-off public assets, as well as fixing the exchange rate, resulting in another death blow to Ukrainian manufacturing and insufficient official reserves, which would force the country to take out, you guessed it, more loans. Another one-year, $600 million loan followed in 2004, and a two-year, $16.4 billion loan was generously provided in 2008.
As far as economic analysis goes, is all he has to do just say, big loan IMF? Is that it? And why does he still keep on talking about the economic situation in a period that Ukraine was trying to get out of? Ukraine was trying to get towards the EU and away from Russia. They were still having their economic affairs largely dictated by pro-Russian presidents at this time. How much of this video has just been him rattling off like, oh, the number of loans taken out from the IMF? Okay.
In July of 2010, the IMF provided a $16.5 billion loan, which required the already economically struggling country to increase household utility prices and to reduce state subsidies and pensions, something the relatively old general population of Ukraine relied on as wages were abysmally low and with no tie to inflation.
2008 was the pro-West, but he's been using 2011, 2008, 1998. Yeah, okay.
Prior to these conditions, Ukrainians were
we're flailing. We're just trying to follow his timeline, okay?
Paying 20% of the cost of imported gas. This IMF-imposed change led to a 50% increase in household utility prices in August of 2010, with further increases planned but postponed ahead of the 2012 parliamentary elections. I can't imagine why. By the end of 2013, Ukraine's public debt was 41% of GDP. The IMF's 2014 report projected that debt would reach 68% of GDP by the end of 2014. Basically, Ukraine was borrowing just to keep the country and government running because the currency was more and more worthless, and there were no other funds they could tap into, a problem the IMF...
So now he's gone 2010, right? This is when Yanukovych won, right? Because Yanukovych won in the beginning of 2010. So now, hang on, so look at this. This whole part here.
2014. The IMF's by the end of 2013, 12 parliamentary... This IMF-imposed change, Ukrainians were only paying 20% of the cost of imported gas. This IMF-imposed change led to a 50% increase in household utility prices in August of 2010, with further increases planned but postponed ahead of the 2012 parliamentary elections. I can't...
Was it 2010 he goes back here?
...of Ukraine prices and to reduce...
Yeah, July 2010, yeah.
In July of 2010, the IMF provided a $16.5 billion loan, which required the already economically struggling country to increase household utility prices and to reduce state subsidies.
41% debt to GDP isn't even that bad. I'm pretty sure in the UK, our debt to GDP is like 100%, isn't it? And in France, it's like 110. Yeah, the guy's a tanky. He doesn't know fucking anything about economics. It's fine. Like, again, 2010 is, that's Yanukovych. He won the presidency in January, February 2010.
And pensions, something the relatively old general population of Ukraine relied on as wages were abysmally low and with no tie to inflation. Prior to these conditions, Ukrainians were only paying 20% of the cost of imported gas. This IMF-imposed change led to a 50% increase in household utility prices in August of 2010, with further increases planned but postponed ahead of the 2012 parliamentary elections. I can't imagine why. By the end of 2013, Ukraine's public debt was 41% of GDP.
I love it that you can just throw that shit up. Oh god, yeah, UK is nearly 100%. This was when. I love it. You just get to throw these massive numbers around and people just gobble that shit. Like, if you look at the entire OECD, debt as a proportion of GDP, is it, hang on, it's not more than 100% like the OECD average, is it? It totally is. 120. Japan, look at Japan, bro. 240%. Spain, Britain, France, Belgium, USA. Damn. Pretty sure these utilities were priced by Russia and subsidized by UA. Is that true? Because they were energy dependent on... Hang on. What year are we talking about here? Are we on 2013-14 around this time? I'm not really keeping up with his experimental filmmaking here.
50% increase in household utility for the gas. This IMF-imposed change led to a 50% increase in household utility prices in August of 2010, with further increases planned.
2010? So this is under Yanukovych again. I'm sorry, wasn't Ukraine getting its gas from, its natural gas from Russia at this time? This is why the Russian deal for Ukraine, to try and get them away from the EU, they offer them a discount for gas. There's no, hang on. There's no way I need to look at the details for the actual utility prices. Well, utility prices would have been tied to gas imports. So, hang on. What do you mean they were priced by Russia? Do you mean they were priced by Russia because of the gas costs? I don't know what you mean by that, Pedro. Russia has a supply agreement with Ukraine for X price. UA pays, but consumers only pay 20% of it, government subsidized. So that means like Gazprom has already increased. This was 2014 when Gazprom was increasing Ukrainians' gas prices, which was Russia's highest in Europe, 81%. Because if we're talking about gas and household utility prices and the timelines that he's talking about, post-2010 election with Yanukovych, is he actually using Russian economic coercion and exploitation of Ukraine as examples of why the IMF is bad and why Western integration is bad? Because what I'm hearing is him going, the IMF gave this XYZ loan to Ukraine in 2010. Okay, so they give a big loan. Then the result is that Ukraine has to pay a shit ton for gas and increase their household utility costs, even though the gas prices came from Russia, not from the IMF. This is from 2009. The price of Russian gas for Ukraine is likely to reach 300 to 310 per 1,000 cubic meters in the first quarter of 2010, from about $208 in the last quarter of 2009. That's a big jump. This would have been from Gazprom. Huh. Golly.
But postponed ahead of the 2012 parliamentary elections. I can't imagine why. By the end
this would be Yanukovych again, because he was president at that time.
2013, Ukraine's public debt was 41% of GDP. The IMF's 2014 report projected that debt would reach 68% of GDP by the end of 2014.
Bruh.
Basically, Ukraine was borrowing just to keep the country and government running because the currency was more and more worthless, and there were no other funds they could tap into, a problem the IMF caused. The debt-to-GDP ratio is expected to reach between 99% and 134% by 2016, but to paint a bright picture for creditors, the IMF believed Ukraine would likely default on their debt obligations long before reaching these levels. By the end of that same year, Ukraine's international reserves dwindled to a weak $7.5 billion, which is less than half of what the US spends on its military per day. In 2020, the IMF forced Ukraine to open up its land market for sale, lifting a 19-year ban on the sale of farmland as a condition for another $8 billion loan. This move was another step towards selling Ukraine to Western agribusiness, which would further consolidate ownership of land and intensify large-scale industrial agriculture in Europe's breadbasket at the expense of Ukrainian farmers. It gets worse, but you get the point by now.
Well, again, you could probably explain why that's bad.
It's a breadbasket at the expense of Ukrainian farmers. It gets worse, but you get the point by now. Force a loan through sketchy politics, impose the selling off of public and productive assets to private interests, watch money fall through corrupt holes, or be simply used to continue the functioning of the country as all the productive money-making stuff goes to private hands, rinse and repeat. Hopefully, even from just this cursory overview, you see the leading role these institutions play in exacerbating.
What does US military spending have to do with Ukrainian foreign currency reserves? Again, it's incoherent, okay? Just the more numbers makes it sound like it's a more informed story. But what he's talking about here is he's grabbing these like random timelines that are scattered all over the place from getting money from the IMF at around the same time, when they also have staunchly pro-Russian presidents at the same time. And he's talking about like IMF loans, but then also fuel costs and the costs of gas, which are set by Gazprom, like a Russian national gas firm. But it's all just like everything bad about the Ukrainian economy in 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14. It's apparently all the IMF's fault and not also the country that the Ukraine was massively dependent on for energy. Like, yeah. Oh, God. Again, he's just explaining why Ukraine was suffering so much worse than other former Soviet states that aligned with the EU instead. But he's just not mentioning that, like, I'm sorry, the Baltic states, they were all getting IMF money and European Union integration before around this time, actually more so than Ukraine. Those economies were much more integrated than Ukraine, and they did better than Ukraine did, despite the fact that Ukraine had a kind of like balancing act between the West and with Russia.
Creating Ukraine's debt crisis.
That's a very long quote. I would like to reiterate that all of this happened before the Russian invasion of 2022. I emphasize this because it's important to understand just how bad Ukraine had it before Russian bombs started falling. The conflict in eastern Ukraine and the pandemic had driven humanitarian needs to unprecedented levels. In 2022, 2.9 million people were projected to require humanitarian assistance, with a good chunk of these residing in non-government controlled areas. But even within government controlled areas, these displaced populations still suffer, essentially experiencing a heightened state of what was already underway in other parts of Ukraine. Healthcare staff shortages haven't likewise helped the situation. In Donetsk, Luhansk oblasts, intensive care unit occupancy rates were among the highest nationwide, with no help in sight. Remember, these are areas mostly under Ukrainian government control. The conflict pushed an already economically troubled region further into decline. The Donetsk and Luhansk republics, once industrially thriving, have seen drastic declines in economic activity since 2014. Unemployment rates are among the highest in Ukraine in these regions, with 16% of these oblasts compared to a national average of 10.3% in 2021. So they're talking about the Russian troops being in eastern Ukraine. We're talking about the war. I'm sorry, did IMF loans do this as well, or did it have to do with the Russian military being in their country? Okay. Let's see where he says. Let's see where he goes. The war prior to 2022, as well as the imposition of neoliberal policies, contributed to this economic stagnation in previously industrial productive areas. Food insecurity isn't much better. Severe food insecurity about 3%, moderate insecurity about 26% in these regions. Water supply systems were likewise severely damaged, leaving approximately 1.4 million people, including 29% of all residents, in need of assistance with sanitation. There were many years to diplomatically solve this issue before it spiraled out of control, with blame firmly on both sides. Okay, both sides. Well done, dude. What, like in the Minsk agreement, where Russia couldn't even acknowledge that they had troops in the region and where therefore couldn't fulfill their entire end of the deal. God. Western intentions. Let's go.
With all this in mind, it should be very clear that Western foreign policy towards Ukraine and Russia throughout the last few decades have produced outcomes that are opposite to those of their stated goals. The US says it views Ukraine's strategic positioning as a buffer state as crucial. The liberal think tank the Brookings Institute even noted this failure when it said, but when juxtaposed with the pride and paranoias of Russians like Vladimir Putin, it inadvertently contributed to a Russian geostrategic and historical narrative that was both predictable and dangerous.
It's also ironic that people in the West, when they talk about NATO expansion, it's true that most liberals people who are like foreign policy analysts will admit that NATO expansion made Russia angry. They will of course admit that. Nothing about buffer state, no. I think he added that part in. When they talk about NATO expansion in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, they talk about it making Russia angry. But the problem is the other half that people like Hakim don't seem to notice is, why did these countries want to join NATO? And it's because even before the IMF was doing anything, before Russia even joined the IMF, they were already, after 1991, aggressing on former Soviet areas, like Transnistria, like the Georgian Civil War. They were already involving themselves in areas where Russia used to have control and then lost it out of the Soviet Union. They were already trying to rebuild as much of the Soviet Union as they could before the IMF did anything. When Russia was, like he says, in ruins, they still managed to find enough fucking cops and soldiers to move into these areas and grab and consolidate control and grab territory.
Stupid Marvel movie type thinking and quips aside, There were past warnings about the dangers of NATO expansion into Ukraine, such as those by CIA Director William Burns in 2008.
Again, NATO expansion into Ukraine wasn't why Russia invaded Crimea. It's not why they sent troops into the Donbass. That's not why Russia did that. Russia did that in response to the Ukrainians overthrowing Yanukovych over a disagreement over the EU deal. It's because the Ukrainians rejected economic integration with Russia, leaned towards the EU, and then got rid of the pro-Russian president who shot his own fucking people through the cops. That's why they did. Yeah, that's why they did it. Ukraine's status with regards to NATO didn't actually change in 2014. Their status with regards to NATO was exactly the same in 2014 as it was in 2008. It was frozen.
When he was serving as the US ambassador to Russia, stating Ukrainian entry into
Crimea was quite pro-Russian too, I think. Crimea was pro-Russian more so than the rest of Ukraine. You would have to also ask someone like Hakim is like, what should they have done then? What should Ukraine have done as a country bordered with Russia coming out of the Soviet Union? Should they have gone with Russia, where they were manipulating the costs of gas and charging them more than any other country in Europe? Should they have gone with the EU or the IMF, or should they have done what communism? Yeah, had a revolution, which none of them wanted to have.
NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. It is a direct challenge to Russian interests. It's not even clear the US has a good reason to think that Ukraine has a chance against Russia in a drawn-out conflict, because Ukraine has limited manpower and is completely dependent on the West for weapons and aid, which ultimately make it extremely vulnerable, as shown by the progress Russia made while the US Congress bickered about a bill to send more military aid to Ukraine and the genocidal state of Israel. This doesn't mean the West
He bleeped out Israel. Okay, dude. Hang on.
Conflict, because Ukraine has limited manpower and is completely dependent on the West for weapons and aid, which ultimately make it.
What progress are we talking about here? What, 3 days to Kyiv? Remember that convoy that tried to? What do you call this fucking progress? They've lost like hundreds of thousands of troops. The Russians. They're stuck in the mud. Why is this progress?
Extremely vulnerable, as shown by the progress Russia made while the US Congress bickered about a bill to send more military aid to Ukraine and the genocidal state of Israel. This doesn't mean the West hasn't benefited from allyship with Ukraine, but it's in ways that exclusively benefit those Western nations, and particularly the US, at Ukraine's expense. The best example of this is the US and the rest of the West using Ukraine as a proxy battleground to drain Russian military resources and test the West's latest and greatest weaponry in a live-fire environment. And you don't have to take my word for it. U.S. Defense Secretary.
Again, are we just gonna give some agency to the Ukrainians? I know it's really difficult because they are one of the ultimate rejectors of your fucking retarded, economically illiterate, anti-human rights, fucking dictatorial, gulag, fucking famine-causing shithole ideology. I know the Ukrainians are like that, you know, and you think they're actually fucking subhuman for the decisions that they made in the 90s and wherever else. But can we stop pretending to care about what Ukrainians think and about what's best for them? Because right now, the Ukrainians understand that they can't give up. They can't, because they understand that if they give up, Russia controls parts of their territory, even if it's in the east. They know what happens to the people who fall under Russian rule. They saw what happened in Bucha. They saw what happened in Izium. They've seen the mass graves. They've seen the suppression of free speech and human rights and the people getting extrajudicially fucking kidnapped and executed and tortured. They've seen all that. They know what happens when Russia takes territory and holds on to it. They saw what happened in Crimea when like millions of people, when a bunch of people had to fucking flee, and where a bunch of people got fucking conscripted to join the army, where it got turned into a launch pad for their invasion in 2022, the kidnapping of Ukrainian children. They know what happens when they lose. That's why even now, when they are just so exhausted, it's still a majority of them who want to keep on fighting. It's been the case since the beginning of the war.
Lloyd Austin explicitly stated that the US goal in Ukraine was to see Russia weakened due to the war. This approach results in Ukraine's defense becoming a completely secondary goal, favoring broader strategic objectives instead of, well, Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. Increasingly,
again, the Ukrainian people who want to keep fighting. Yes, the Ukrainians whose top priority right now is getting Russia out. The Ukrainians who, thanks to this war, want to join NATO more than they ever have.
The US and NATO show less and less enthusiasm for Ukraine, even changing their tune on reconquering lost territories. Austin's comments suggest that they either prefer an endless war against Russia or one that results in settlement, as Ukraine continues to be bled dry of its already catastrophic demographics. Ukraine is an example of the total failure of neoliberal policies Western institutions and nations are so insistent on implementing in states they can easily exploit via economic shock treatment.
Again, it's so fucking dumb. Why would you say this when Ukraine was of all the ex-Soviet states that you could talk about, whether it's the Baltics or whether it's like even former Warsaw Pact countries, why would you use Ukraine, which was the country that was actually less integrated with the West than any of the other ones? Ukraine was less integrated with the West than Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, or even like Poland, Hungary, like Czech Republic, like Czechia, Slovakia. If you wanted to say that Western influence in these economies, that's why Ukraine got... Why wouldn't you compare it to countries that actually integrated more with the West than Ukraine did, that fully integrated with the West?
For the 3 decades prior to the Russian invasion until today, a complete lack of care for the people of Ukraine has been evident, as Ukraine is dismantled for parts sold in flash sales for the benefit of capital abroad. All of these billions in aid that Ukraine is supposedly receiving, where is it all going?
So-called aid.
Despite fighting separatists since 2014 and Russia since 2022, the humanitarian aid sent to Ukraine is shockingly low compared to the vast military support they get. The United States, of course, leads this imbalance, offering $9.4 billion in humanitarian aid while pouring $70 billion into military efforts.
Okay.
The European Union, despite...
Typically, weapons are more expensive than humanitarian aid, yes. Food is cheaper than JDAMs. Yeah.
Surpassing the US in overall support, shows a similar pattern despite being more directly affected by the war. The EU's humanitarian aid stands at $30.5 billion, but its financial and military commitments nonetheless dominate.
How stupid is this objection? Again, it's just like tankies. They just see numbers and throw them around. That's it. Just like, the Western countries, they don't care about Ukrainians because they're spending more money on guns than on bread. Like, of course they are, because actually one thing that helps the humanitarian situation is that Ukraine can keep Russian invaders out of their towns. And that is more expensive than feeding the refugees who need food. Are there Ukrainian refugees in the West who are like starving and shit because of a lack of Western humanitarian aid? And the West are just like, nah, fuck them. Just give them guns. Just give a bunch of starving Ukrainians more guns and let them struggle to pick up the big heavy JDAM. Oh, God.
Germany, Canada, the UK, Denmark, Norway, it doesn't matter. This imbalance reflects a broader tendency among Western nations to prioritize profits for the various companies involved in the military-industrial complex.
Even, the profits for the military-industrial complex. We can look at this as well. What, Raytheon, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin. Should we look at them since the war started? Let's have a look at their profits. Let's have a look at their stonks. You have to go between the war, I suppose, like from the war to, I guess, the war in Israel, I suppose, because maybe things would have changed then. It's not like, look at this, like this is Raytheon. There's a bit of a bump at the invasion, 83 to what, like 90, 100. It drops here. Is this the heist? The Ukraine war heist? This is what it was all for. All that election meddling for Boeing as well, right? This isn't even to mention, yeah, of course, you got the pandemic as well. Like this is 2019. They're at 93 here. Even actually Lockheed Martin are not that high compared to, they're not much higher than pre-pandemic levels. 2020, look at this. So they dip in the pandemic and then it just goes back again. Like, but that's it.
Over essential humanitarian support. Remember, most of this money in military aid isn't going to Ukraine. It's tax money or finance capital used to subsidize shipment orders from weapons industry that might eventually go to Ukraine. This is a gift to military industry, that's all. They're even gloating about it on the Department of Defense website.
I wonder if you ask the Ukrainians about like how they feel about getting support from... Oh, God.
This overwhelming focus on arming Ukraine during a preventable war over the needs of Ukrainians, or God forbid diplomatic solutions to the conflict...
Please, okay, you can say that. What do you think the Ukrainians need right now? Please say that. Come on.
...shows profound neglect of the essential humanitarian needs and well-being of the Ukrainian people. This approach not only fails to address the immediate needs of these Ukrainians, but also jeopardizes the long-term stability and recovery of the country, which has already been bought and sold as an investment opportunity for Western capital, much like
you mean a so-called investment opportunity? Come on.
For Iraq following the illegal American invasion. For the few silly people who might think I'm overemphasizing peace, as if there is such a thing, I'm Iraqi. They haven't experienced the horrors of war, but I have. That's the only explanation as to why they continue to call for an endless war with a depopulated Ukrainian rump state run...
It's Ukrainians support the war, you f***ing moron. Stop! Oh, God.
...by and for EU and American business interests. Diplomacy and mediation could have prevented all of this, and still can solve this issue.
Remember how they said that NATO, their guidelines are 2% of your GDP on military expenditure? Which some countries in NATO don't even fulfill. They don't even do that. They don't even do that much. Like, what's Russia doing for military expenditure in 2014? Why does it go up? Why does it go up after 2014? What were they going to do then? 4%, 4.9, 5.4. Ooh, what was going on here? What were they getting busy with around then?
Issue, but peace was against the scheming of Western capital and its foreign policy arms. That doesn't absolve Russia from what it's done, but let's not pretend this was a one-sided conflict. Western involvement in Ukraine has been a disaster. They have deepened Ukraine's suffering and instability for their own geostrategic ends, proving that their involvement is actively harmful. The oligarchs, both of Ukraine and Russia, managed to, somehow, care even less.
Also, I thought you mentioned it when he said that they were test firing modern weapons in Ukraine. Isn't one of the big critiques now that the weapons that are getting sent to Ukraine are old weapons? But apparently it's test firing modern. Okay. It doesn't make any fucking sense. I mean, he's ignored Ukrainians for this entire thing. He's ignored the fact that the majority of Ukrainians, like 90+% of them, voted for independence before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, before the dissolution. He's completely ignored the fact that the Ukrainians in 2014 en masse wanted to join the European Customs Agreement. And he's ignoring the fact that Ukrainians en masse now want to join NATO. And he's ignored the fact that most Ukrainians want to continue fighting. He's ignored all of it, yeah. He doesn't care. It's paternalistic bullshit. And this guy, the amount of fucking time he spent looking up the exact numbers of the sizes of the IMF loans and then looking up economic issues in Ukraine that were actually to do with Russia fixing like Russian gas prices to Ukraine. The amount of time he spends looking for all those numbers, you'd think he would maybe look at what Ukrainian public opinion is for any of this, which suggests he knows. And just it's an inconvenience to him. Because people from Eastern Europe have always been an inconvenience to Marxist-Leninists. Because they are the people who had every opportunity to see the fucking pride and joy of Marxist-Leninism. And they saw it and they were like, nah, no.
At the very least, understand this. Ukraine has lowered the conscription age yet again, and millions have gone abroad never to return. An entire generation of Ukraine's youth is either dead or outside the country. If this keeps going, there might not even be a Ukraine left after this war. But those trillions of dollars...
He almost paraphrased in the most disgusting way the thing that Ukrainians say. Because there's the Ukrainian saying, isn't it, that if Russia stops fighting, there'll be no more war. If Ukraine stops fighting, there'll be no more Ukraine. Russia tried to take Kyiv. They thought they could take it in 3 days. They sent a massive fucking convoy all the way up there. And whose fault will that be? It'll typically, when a country gets invaded, whose fault will mean that there's no Ukraine? Probably the country that's invading them and destroying them. Nuclear, probably Russia. The country whose leader, by the way, was pressed to blame NATO for the war by Tucker Carlson, and instead wanted to talk about fucking Oleg the Wise and how Ukraine has basically been Russia's 1,000-plus-year-old little brother, where they basically belong as two parts of the same country. Oh, God. Don't forget Oleg the Wise. Never forget.
Dollars and resources under Ukraine need to be garnished by multinational corporations, after all. Finally, for the "this is all Russia's fault and the West did nothing wrong" crowd, read the following article.
I love it. Just read the following article. The same article by the guy who said that Putin would never invade Ukraine. In 2014, he said Russia's never going to invade Ukraine. Putin's too smart. Putin's too smart. The same guy who literally showed polling data and then just ignored the fact that most Ukrainians wanted to join the EU. God.
The Ukrainian people can, along with working people everywhere else, guarantee their rights.
By the way, Mearsheimer, who is a Cold War American conservative, by the way. Mearsheimer, who really, he's upset about Russia-Ukraine because he really wanted America to stay friends with Russia as a bulwark against China. That's why Mearsheimer says what he does about Ukraine. He said that. He said it openly in interviews.
Only the Ukrainian people can, along with working people everywhere else, guarantee their rights, and this will happen solely through a blueprint that they built by their own hands just a few decades ago. A better world is possible. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help.
I'm surprised people don't react to, like other streamers or other creators don't react to Hakim more often, because every video is like this. Maybe it's because he does his little technique here is like he bombards you with stats and figures, even though they are completely incoherent half the time, and they also leave out much more crucial information. Like the fact that he's mentioned the will of the Ukrainian people and what's best for the Ukrainians a million times in his video, but hasn't shown one opinion poll on what the Ukrainians have wanted throughout all of this, whether it was the independence referendum before dissolving the union, whether it was anything else like that. The fact that he's like more interested in just bringing up the the size of IMF loans, whilst also talking about the economic consequences of Russia f***ing with gas prices to Ukraine. You got to read the comments. Yeah, this guy is like a serial fucking disinformation merchant. Like, but yeah, people just, I don't think he really gets called out that often for it. Weird how all the guys who said Russia isn't going to invade switched to Russia invaded, but it's actually America's fault as soon as Russia actually invaded. Wait, is that you guys? This is him referencing Mearsheimer and Hassan and people like that. Yeah, good comment. Good comment. I like it. YouTube is going to try and hide this video as much as it can. Bro, that Mearsheimer video got like 30 million views. What the fake oppression is so dumb. Nuland phone call was about a deal that Yanukovych was proposing with the opposition in late January 2014, in which Yanukovych would appoint some of the coalition leaders as government ministers in exchange for telling the protesters to go home, a deal which did not go through. Instead, the violence escalated until Yanukovych fled the country in late February. The Nuland phone call was the Americans choosing who would replace Yanukovych is a colossal lie told by propagandists, taking advantage of people unfamiliar with Ukraine's system of government, i.e. that the country has both the president and prime minister. Yeah, this is... okay. Yeah. Wait, this isn't you guys, is it? Bullshit video. Ukraine voted 92% for independence after the fall of the USSR. Even Crimea voted for being part of Ukraine. True. Very true. Can you elaborate on the fact that you mentioned at the beginning that the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians did not want to leave the Union? When I Googled it, I can only find the 1991 referendum with more than 90% voting for independence. March referendum. You need the month. What happened after March? Dude, why do they not know? I feel like that's a good question to ask. If you were wanting to get an answer out of him, is like, why do you ignore the August referendum where every region of Ukraine voted majority to be independent? It's always good to know that these talking points, that this narrative is like, it's been well enough challenged, I think, online that people actually know what to say to it. Wait, what referendum came before the December 91 one? The preservation of this is, what the fuck? What referendum came before the 91 referendum? The preservation of the Union, which the vast majority of Ukrainians supported. No, you fucking lying cunt. So he does know. The preservation of the Union contingent on democratic and on reforms. A reformed Soviet Union. The reforms failed. The hardline communists tried to fucking coup the government. And then, yes, you're right, time is a thing. Time is a factor. When we have an election, we don't put the winner of the previous election in government. You understand that, right? When the August coup happened, mostly because people were like, whoa, what if this succeeded? We don't want to be part of this. They decided to leave the Union. Yes. Yes, the circumstances changed. Yes. Oh, what an absolute fucking snake. Why? The coup failed. I'm sorry, Leandro. If you vote to stay in the Soviet Union because they're promising reforms, and the people who oppose those reforms and want you back under the boot almost succeed in a coup, that might change your opinion on whether or not you want to stay in this union. Is that not valid? Actually, fuck you. It doesn't matter why the Ukrainians changed their position and decided to vote for independence. They did. It doesn't matter why they changed their minds. You don't have an election in 2024 and then appeal to the government that won the election in 2020. Do you? Can you imagine if Trump wins the election in November and Biden makes himself the president and just says, I'm sorry, who won the election in 2020? What the fuck are you talking about? He knows the date. He knows the month of the... First of all, the Ukrainian referendum, hang on, was it December? Ukraine independence. They declared independence in August. Yeah, it was 1st of December. Okay. Yeah, look at that result, though. It's pretty fucking overwhelming, bro. Oh, that's so fucking slimy. Oh, shit. Oh, God, I hate him so much. What an absolute fucking cunt, man. He knows. What? How is he comprehending that? Does anyone mention this? Anyone respond to this? In 1991, the mood shifted because the USSR was in chaos. There were proto-civil war happening in many regions, and nobody knew what will happen next. So it was like, would you like to live in an independent state or in Mad Max world? Yeah, that's their choice. It's not a coincidence that every fucking republic made the same decision. 6 republics had actually already boycotted the first referendum. The one the preservation of the Union, which again, it's not just the preservation of the Union. It was the preservation of a reformed Soviet Union. And people lost faith in those reforms pretty quickly because they realized that the communists, the hardliners, almost fucking couped the government. Jesus Christ. Unbelievable propagandist hack. Fuck. Ugh! I'm triggered. Okay, whatever. Is he doing it again? Exact opposite. March referendum was for maintaining the union. Only after the illegal dissolution did they have the independence referendum, which was accepted since Russia and Belarus pulled out. Oh, the illegal no, wait. The dissolution was in the end of December. Is he talking about the Declaration of Independence? The dissolution of the Soviet Union was December 25th. Only when it was illegally dissolved against their will was the referendum of independence passed through. No, the referendum was held before the dissolution. Oh, God. Again, the Declaration of Independence from Ukraine was right after the August coup. On August 24th, Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary of the Communist Party Soviet Union and dissolved all party units in the government. This is the illegal dissolution he's talking about. That's it. 5 days later, the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union indefinitely suspended all Communist Party Soviet Union activity on Soviet territory, effectively ending communist rule in the Soviet Union and dissolving the only remaining unifying force in the country. Ah, that's what they're talking about. He established the State Council of the Soviet Union, designed to bring him and the highest officials of the remaining politics into collective leadership. Between August and December, 10 republics seceded from the Union, largely out of fear of another coup. By the end of September, Gorbachev no longer had the ability to influence events outside of Moscow. He was challenged even by Yeltsin. It's like Iowa and 2 more states decide to secede. No, you need everyone to agree. If you're in a situation where it's not even slightly comparable, I don't even know why the fuck you would make that comparison. If you're in a situation where you've already got multiple republics voting against the idea of voting for their own nationalist parties that have secession in mind, and if you already have an attempted coup on the government that basically disempowers the leader, and you have a referendum of unity that's basically built on the promise of reforms that never fucking happen or never going to happen, and then you have a situation where every fucking member state has 90% of its people wanting to leave, yeah, you're done. You've lost it. Yeah, you're fucked. Not going to mention the Ukraine People's Republic, the Holodomor, the Polish-Soviet War. Oh no. Oh no. I love it. The cop-outs are so good. Holodomor, don't make me laugh my ass off by your historic knowledge. Don't make me laugh my ass off. No elaboration. Let's go.